Hello, everyone. Myself, Divya Jindal, your host for the session today. And on behalf of Building Accessible, Safe and Inclusive Indian Cities program at NIUA, I welcome everyone to the lecture series Think Urban, Think Inclusive. This 8-part lecture series is themed Think Urban, Think Inclusive, and it focuses on discussing approaches for making Indian cities accessible, safe, and inclusive for all. The series is designed as a discussion with key sector experts and change makers and leaders to focus and collectively think and find ways and tools to improve lives and empower persons with disability, elderly, and young children and their caregivers with everyday freedoms within the urban ecosystem that they are part of. Before we begin the session, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping points. One, it's a pre-recorded event. The platform may experience a few second delays. So while recording, depending on the internet connection, you may experience some latency in the audio and video. The entire lecture will have closed captioning included at the bottom of this recording. The session is designed in a concise format with a short introduction, setting up of the context, a 15 to 18-minute presentation by the presenter, and a round of Q&A. If you're watching this on YouTube, we encourage you to use the comment section to share your feedback or post questions and discuss and initiate a discussion with all of us. For today, our we are joined by Dr. Umamaheshwaran Rajasekar. Welcome, Dr. Mahesh. For the benefit of our audience, let me take a minute here to introduce our speaker with all of you. Dr. Mahesh chairs the Urban Resilience Unit and he's heading the Climate Center for Cities, CCube, better known as CCube at NIUA. He has over 18 years of experience in developing risk reduction strategies, climate change analysis, institutional strengthening of governments, INGOs, and multilateral agencies. His recent efforts have been towards bridging the technology and communication gap to enable informed decision-making. He has led and managed some of the pioneering risk resilience efforts in India, including implementation of early warning systems, urban disease surveillance, and city resilience strategies. With extensive published and peer-reviewed journal articles, technical reports, he has been presenting at various international and national forums. Several of his works have been commended in the form of grants and awards. His recent work on development and implementation of urban health services monitoring system has been recognized as an intervention to watch by the UN Secretary General's Globe Pulse Initiative. Today, he'll be sharing and speaking with us on the topic of climate change risks and building resilience and building better for persons with disability. I'll just quickly give you a brief about the topic. Of course, we all understand here that climate change poses a direct and indirect risks to human health and livelihoods via its impact on the, depending on its impact on the frequency and the severity of extreme weather events and, and also the slow onset of ecosystem degradation that we are experiencing today. Disabled population is particularly at a higher risk, as often they have limited access to knowledge, resources, services to effectively respond to these environmental changes. They have also compromised health conditions, making them even more vulnerable to extreme climate events and ecosystem service loss or infectious diseases. Persons with disability are also most affected in these case because they require evacuation and they need support and many other requirements in addition to what other people or normal people may need. It is clearly understood that there's a critical need for cities and local governments and civil societies to work together to find ways out of, a way out of these growing challenges that climate change is posing for all of us. Apart from governments investing in developing mitigation and adaptation strategies, they also need to respond to varied climate risk and understanding the fact that there is little consideration or inclusion of disabled within their plans at this given point of time. With these growing climatic concerns, it is, an urgent need for a more inclusive climate change discourse within our system and within our daily discussions about climate change. And this lecture therefore calls for greater efforts to understand and raise the profile of persons with disability within, climate change adaptation discourses, policies, and practices, and in general. To do so, we intend to bring a dominant narrative on the subject today here with Dr. Mahesh here, and discuss and find out how we can collectively think about it and, put this together. On that note, I would like to invite Mr. Mahesh to share his insights on the presentation on the subject with all of us.
Thank you, Divya, for the wonderful introduction. And I think it's urban planning and also in terms of urban development, how we can try to include new aspects which specific. I just wanted to give you a larger outline in terms of what my presentation is going to be. I'll be starting by talking about the current trends, what's happening with respect to the urban areas in India especially, and what are the current levels of services, what we are talking about, and where we stand as a nation, and how cities are trying to cater to some of the critical needs of the people at large, and what is the distribution of people with disabilities, and what is happening with respect to climate and how it may differentially impact them, and what are all the measures which could be done, undertaken both at a city level, state level, and also at a country level, and what are the good practices which are existing as we speak, and what other countries are doing where India can also learn from. So I'll quickly share my slides, and hopefully everybody is able to see that. So today I'm going to talk about climate change risks and building back better for persons with disability. So what we are currently witnessing is the number of extreme events, especially the frequency and the intensity of the cyclones, are increasing. As we speak, currently we have Cyclone Gulab, which is about to have its landfall in both Andhra Pradesh and also going to affect Telangana and state of Odisha. So while we were thinking about cyclones at large, this is one of the first, this is one of the few cyclone events which over the last 120 years of monitoring, where we have realized that there are only limited number which have originated in the Bay of Bengal during the month of September, and this is one such events. And also what we are more and more witnessing is the number of rainy days are decreasing, while the Bay of Bengal and the western coast, the eastern coast of India are witnessing heavy rainfall. The western coast of India is going through severe drought. States like Gujarat, where currently only around 70 to 80% of the total annual rainfall is currently achieved, and the state may experience drought if they don't get the sufficient rainfall over the next couple of days. And given this scenario of one area getting high degree of rainfall or extreme rainfall and the other area not getting enough sufficient rainfall, or the number of rainy days decreasing, is leading to more and more issues of both waterlogging and also water scarcity in urban areas. The other key aspect, what we are also observing, is this trend is not something new. What we have been, if you look at the graph, it pretty much projects the rainfall departure, or events where some of the places have got more rainfall and some of the places have got less rainfall. And if you look at it, pretty much the trend has been varying starting from 1901 to 1960. But if you look in terms of the variation, extent of variation, starting from 1970, the extent of variation has severely increased. So the periods of extreme drought and also the period of extreme flooding is quite possible with these excess variation. And that is what is of severe concern to climate scientists. And the same is the case of temperature. The average temperature within urban areas are usually higher. That is because of the urban heat and effect, and usually caused by the impervious nature of the urban geography. But what is also more, scary is the number of people who are exposed to such heat waves. Earlier in a rural area, even during the daytime, even if the temperatures are quite high, it used to fall back to normalcy during evening time. There always used to be a cool breeze flowing in, even for some of the cities which are in the central part of India. And cities like Indore used to be called as Shabbe Malwa, because in the evening time during summer months, it used to be quite cooler. But that situation is currently changing because the radiative heat, which is caused by impervious surfaces, is leading to heat, getting experienced by people well through the night and all the way till 12, 12 o'clock or 1 a.m. in the morning, where the heat is still quite felt, and because of which there is an excess use of air conditioning and things. The same is also witnessed during the months of winter, where we get sprouts, cold waves, which have a severe impact on certain segment of the population, especially the vulnerable people who cannot afford, and disabled people who cannot change their lifestyle quickly, or who needs certain kind of additional support during these periods of changes. Apart from these, precipitation, cold wave, and heat wave, what we are also observing because of the temperature change and because of the precipitation and waterlogging, the extent of waterborne diseases and vector-borne diseases are also equally increasing. And survivability of some of the vectors, especially mosquitoes, are extending well into the winter months. Earlier, we used to hear about cases of malaria, dengue, and chikungunya, especially during the monsoons and immediately after the monsoons, months of September and October. But now we are seeing those cases emerge even in the months of November and December, because these mosquitoes are able to find conducive temperatures or suitable temperatures for their survivability within urban areas in smaller pockets, if not at a macro level. And the rate of impact is quite higher because the density of is also quite high. Affects one person, especially that they don't know the economic boundaries. So if you go to Mumbai, you have slums and you have high-income clothes in its clothes business. It starts to spread. It has quite a good possibility of it affecting a significant number of urban population, irrespective of whether they are disabled, economically poor, or geographically isolated in gated communities, and so on and so forth. So given this nature of climate trends, what is the current situation in India? So India has very limited amount of drinking water availability or surface water availability for its citizens, with a huge population, and especially with a huge urban population, and a lot of our services, there is also a possibility of leakages and other wastages. And so the non-revenue water is also quite high. So putting these two trends together, the average annual per capita water availability is likely to be reduced by 2025. We don't need the climate change to actually impact us. It is just our population, and also the current resources may significantly impact our existing urban population. The second thing is also about the volume of traffic on the road, and it is pretty much increasing by 12% per annum. And while majority of our urban population do depend upon non-motorized transport, the impact of extreme cold and heat are going to affect. And especially when it comes to people with disability, when they need a specialized, uh, vehicle or device to move from one point to another, they may be significantly impacted while they are commuting on the road, more than the pedestrians. The other aspect is, of course, we have quite limited number of schools and other public service facilities. The number of beds in a hospital is less than 0.5 per thousand people, and also 60% of the human waste is dumped currently in the open areas or within the water bodies. And pretty much majority of our water bodies, especially those which are in the urban areas, are severely polluted, especially from domestic waste and also untreated water, especially sewage being dumped into it. So given all these situation put together, further adds stress on people at large. And moreover, our government and our urban local bodies, with their limited revenue, they are always been trying to do a catch-up game. How do we cater to the masses? And how do we cater to the population at large? How do we come up with service level deficiency? And urban areas in the last 20, 30 years, with its population increasing significantly, the extent of open areas, the extent of water bodies, the extent of green areas have also been quite significantly affected because of the previously mentioned reasons. And pretty much the impact of these water bodies are also because of the extent of the resources which are currently available within the municipal corporations and the urban local bodies, where they don't have mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation, they don't have mechanisms for enforcement, they don't have sufficient staffs to cater to the regular need. And all these things, what they are trying to do is they are roughly trying to do a catch-up game, whereas a majority large number of smaller towns which are trying to become urbanized, or which are in the process of getting urbanized, are trying to generate more revenues and people at large, where in some of the places where because of the huge economic disparity within the urban population, they are not able to pay for those services. While they are not able to pay for those services, of course it results in the quality of services getting degraded over time. And also, there is also limited time for planning. If you look in terms of the urban development, our cities in India were pretty much comprising of 11% of the population in 1990 census or 1991 census. But if you look at the 2001 and 2021, pretty much our urban population is double. It went from 11% to 22, 23% in 2001 and 33% in 2021. 2011. And with this pretty much exceeded growth happening over a short time, city administrations do not have time for planning. So when they don't have time for planning, they go with a cookie cutter approach. What worked in one area will always work in another area. And doing in that process, much of our urban areas, they have not thought about disability. They have not thought about vulnerable people. They have not had time to think about innovative planning which cater to that particular geographical context. They have not thought about the variation in climate and its subsequent impact on these population, including disabled people. And their limited human resources currently are trying to do a catch-up game where they have privatized most of the things, but irrespective of it, they don't have sufficient number of people to do the monitoring and evaluation. It's implemented. How do they do the enforcement mechanism? Whatever, if one contractor did not do it properly, whether they penalize them, or what is the extent of penalizing given our legal process and time scale. That consumes more time and energy than actually concentrating on providing a particular set of services. And this creates an additional problem of multiple agency coordination. Simple services like water and solid waste are managed by multiple agencies. There is irrigation department which monitors the water, the reservoir. There is Central Water Commission which looks at the flow of the water in the river, the IMD which looks at the rainfall which is going to come in, or the prediction of the future rainfall which is going to come in. And then there is a Jal Nigam and a Jal Board which tries to provide water. Then there is a sewage and wastewater treatment facility or a department which takes care of that. And then there is a port authority which manages the coastal areas. And then you have private bore wells, and then you have RAWA and agencies which are managing and controlling your underground water storage and overhead water storage and so on and so forth. So given this complicated nature of the urban fabric and also the kind of services, how do you create customized facilities, like you have certain group of people staying together within certain areas with varying needs, and especially with people with disability, people with aged population, people with chronic impacts may need different kinds of facilities at different times of time, the day, and also during different seasons. How do you take all these things into consideration is one of the key challenges. And when we are paying very low for some of our services, for example, water supply, you end up paying 100 rupees or 200 rupees in a month. Whereas if you go to some of the informal settlements, slums, they are paying 20 liters. They are paying 5 to 10 rupees for a bucket of water, that is 20 liters of water. So there is a huge disparity. So people who are economically poor end up paying much more than people who have the pipe water supply. And also much of the supply is highly subsidized. I was earlier giving the example of Indore, whereas Indore gets its water from Narmada, which is transported 70 kilometers, and that to 70 kilometers upstream, and to a height of close to a kilometer. So it is 70 kilometers in horizontal distance and 1 kilometer in vertical distance, 1,000 meters in vertical distance, to cater to the growing population of the Indore city, whereas they end up paying only 100 rupees for the water, and they end up not understanding the value of it. The same happens with many of our services. Our only idea is, how do we cater to the majority, or how do we cater to the mass? But when you look at some of the statistics of what is happening with respect to climate change, it's quite scary. What we are trying to see is there is already an increased frequency of cyclones, and there is more number of people getting affected by flood, and also the number of deaths have increased. And in 2029, cyclonic disturbances pretty much occurred in India, and what UNICEF estimates is more than 2.4 million children were impacted by flood across India. And the insurance companies, their climate projection models are also forecasting that there is a possibility of huge loss, and with respect to the recent event of Kati, which cost more than 15,000 crores. And this is going to continue as we move forward. So the bigger question is, the money which we are trying to invest for our development is getting spent in losses and damage. So there is also a significant heat trend, and this trend is going to continue because, as per NASA, 11 of the India's 15 warmest year has been since 2004. So pretty much every second year, the temperature records were broken, and in 2020 also, in spite of the pandemic, the country suffered from a huge heat wave, where more than 70% of India's population were at least exposed to heat wave in one form or the other. And huge number of deaths are also getting caused, and many times people attribute these deaths not as a heat wave related death, but comorbidity, or people with certain vulnerability, or people especially who are aged are classified as natural deaths. And that is a critical thing. When we don't appreciate or differentiate between these deaths, it becomes highly difficult for any state government or for any city government to initiate measures to ensure such events do not take place in the future. And of course, the disease of burdens, as I was indicating, has increased. And this has also led to people suffering from diarrhea, typhoid, and viral hepatitis over the last couple of years. And these things are of serious concern. And what is more concerned is we are talking about a 2.21% of the total population which are physically disabled. How do we cater to them? Do we negate it because more than 50% of the population is not getting access to water? What different mechanisms can we bring to people with certain kind of vulnerability? Of course, when 50% of the population does not get water, they make arrangements. But when 2.4% of vulnerable population, or especially people with disability, who don't have access, who don't have a financial ability to cater to the needs, it becomes quite important because it has a direct impact on the extent of deaths, on the extent of people going through psychological trauma, people getting sidelined, people who deserve certain services do not get the service they need in time they need. And this becomes much more complicated. But what we are also parallelly observing, there is also an increase in chronic health conditions, which are also people with disability in some form, people with diabetes, people with cardiovascular diseases, people with cancer, people with mental health disorder. This percentage is also significantly increasing. And sometimes we actually look at this particular percentage and take it for granted, but what is more important is 2% of a million plus population is still a huge number of people demanding or catering to this need. And we need, we as citizens, we as more responsible citizens should be more sensitive to this small but significant number of population, and also take into consideration the new and upcoming diseases, and also include other vulnerable aspect, children, pregnant women, even though they are not considered as disability, but they are people with differential needs. Putting all together will create a substantial pool of more than 20% of the urban population to actually cater to the needs. That's why it's important to not only look in terms of only physical disability, but also people who have specific needs, even though they may not be disabled per se in technical terms. So once we bring that in, we have a significant population to cater to. The percentage of significance to bring about a change can be achieved. Otherwise, you will be talking about a small percentage, 2%, and usually when we have a 50% service level deficiency, the 2% gets hidden in the shadows. And it's important for us to bring them to light. And one of the things what we talk about is CVD, hypertension, and people with diabetes. So all these are people with disability. When you put them together, you achieve the number to bring in the transformation, bring in the change, or bring in a differential outlook to what new infrastructure we are investing towards. Every 2 in every 3 senior citizens in India suffer from chronic disease. If you bring that about, so whatever people with chronic disease require, probably it is something similar, which will also be, or some kind of additional thought can get into the early stage of design and planning in much of the infrastructure when we bring about this percentage to influence the change. So what is more needed in India right now is, while it has demonstrated, India has improved itself since the super cyclone from 1999. What it requires is to reduce the loss of life from disaster, which it has done quite effectively. But what is more important is people should start conducting a self-assessment of their needs, and those needs should be compiled and put together to do a pre-disaster planning. What is needed where, which parts of the city. There may be a blind school in one part of the city, there may be a health institution or a hospital in one part of the city. what are the differential needs of these institutions should be highlighted based on the past experience. They don't have to create something new. They don't want to wait. They don't need to wait for a disaster to happen, but just based on the last 20 years of the events, which includes heat waves and which includes cyclones. I think hospitals and these institutions and individuals should start recording the needs and posting it up in a public forum or indicating to their municipal corporation. Therefore, they at least there's some amount of sensitivity can be improved. At the same time, the building bylaws and the building codes should also be improved, because what we see, the 50% deficiency can also be seen as a 50% opportunity. Because of that, a huge amount of infrastructure is yet to be built or it is upcoming. We have a huge opportunity to influence that through a better design and better planning. So even though we keep complaining that India doesn't have sufficient infrastructure, I see it as a good opportunity to include all these aspects which we previously were not able to think about, or because of the time crunch never thought about it. But because of our improved understanding, because of our exposure both internationally and also with respect to the events which has occurred in India over the past 2 decades, using that experience, we can now come up with a better design, help people have better access to buildings, and we can also design mechanism which suit the climate of India or the geography of that particular place. The second need of the hour is during evacuation. People with disability has different challenges and different needs. We need to understand that during an evacuation process or during a disaster management process, and this includes that if there is a map available in terms of who needs what and where. I think our community, what we have seen with respect to pandemic, people are more upcoming, people are more helpful in times of need. But right now we don't know our neighbors because the density is quite high. The number of people are, because of the migration, there is a lot of transit which keeps happening, or movement which keeps happening within the city. How we can create maps not only of evacuation routes but also identify who needs what and where within that, and that can also come to aid for people working in fire station, rescue workers, people, disaster management personnel, and also simple municipal corporation. At least they will be aware what needs to be done. If a significant number of population of a certain nature is in a particular place, then they can prioritize their evacuation. And two, they can also conduct specific drills mentally prepared, and they can have a better estimate of time, because evacuating people may have a different timeline, and evacuating people with disability may have a different timeline, and that can lead to life or death situation in times of need. So differentiating between that and understanding that and prioritizing it is going to be a very important thing. And finally, during rehabilitation, it is also important that we take into consideration the vulnerability and also all kinds of development activity in while rehabilitation is being considered. The common experience reveals that people with disabilities are usually left out, because whenever you call for a meeting, they don't turn up in the meeting, or sometimes they do turn up and they put forward their opinion, but they are the small percentage of population, which accounts to 1 or 2%, like I indicated earlier. Therefore, their voices are not heard sufficiently. And so many a times it also becomes a differential need, which the larger population may not agree to, given the additionality of cost and things like that. So understanding this, but also justifying or catering to them is going to be very important, and it shows how best a city is planned, not for a few individuals, but for all individuals, and how we can have an inclusive development within the next couple of years is going to be the key. Of course, there are a lot of good practices. The first and the foremost thing is the NDMA has a guideline on disability and disaster, which is a good starting point of it. What needs and what efforts need to be done for vulnerable population, and what kind of special attention needs to be paid for people with disability, and in terms of post-disaster needs, in terms of pre-disaster needs, and what kind of special arrangements the administration can make for these people, is clearly highlighted within the document. So we do have policy, we do have guidelines with us, but we should slowly start implementing them within their upcoming planning, city development and projects as much as possible. So similar to India, Spain has also a guideline, but they've gone one step further and enacted a law to provide accessibility of person with disability to health, education, and other relevant services. Probably India also needs to do such thing. One another thing, important thing which they have done is, having convention of people of disability, represented. I think we also need to bring together people with disability together to identify their needs much more clearly than them being part of a larger crowd. State plans for conducting climate change in Cuba includes strategic actions for persons with disability. And this is another thing, how do you facilitate, in spite of whatever negative things we hear about Cuba, there are also positive things and possible measures in which how they promote inclusion of people with certain disabilities within the disaster management and also in the relief. The same is also for Niger Delta, where Global Green Grants Fund has included and also is in the process of providing human rights, health, and social well-being, especially for people with disability. And what's more important is they've created a platform in which the training and the engagement is getting documented, and also people and their information are getting documented, similar to what I was indicating before. If we have a better database, we know whom to access, when to access them, and how to access them, and what needs one can cater in times of a disaster. And in Bangladesh, they have also in the process of developing disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. And these are done at a community level, where community organizers are trained and put forward the importance of educating them in how to handle situations, especially during emergencies, and how to cater to people with disability. And it also, the model encompasses both targeted people and also provide them with employment to further develop it. And there are good practices from El Salvador, where protection of persons with disability is prioritized in event of disaster. Rather than isolating them, or rather than treating them separately, I think there is a clear, specific, measures which are being put in place for people with disability. And this, in this particular country, they were also working with other, government institutions, that is the intergovernmental coordination, and also to raise awareness to ensure that such things are not only done by one single department, but also by all departments. So in final, what Indian cities should need to do, I think chronic disability provides a window of opportunity to strengthen DRR and climate-informed planning. It gives you the sufficient number needed to influence, and also make the necessary change. And better and improved communication is always needed. Usually we find that we don't use good communication to engage with people with disability. I think we need different form of communication, different types of communication, both audio, visual, personal, touch and feel, and also how things are on the ground in terms of how it is evolving. So we need to explore different kind of communication to reach out basic policy information, basic protocols to especially disabled people. And the vulnerable people database, including disability, should be spatially informed and should be created at the city level. So one needs to know where to target. Of course, you can remove the names and you can remove the personal profiles and things like that. But different kinds of needs across different areas within the city needs to be brought about. And at least in terms of an emergency, an SOS can be sent across to the community to make sure that they prioritize, catering to the people with certain kind of disability. And of course, model building bylaws and URDPFI guidelines, which are there at the national level in India, should specifically have chapters or have clear mention within the urban planning guidelines to include people with disability. Of course, there are mention of it, but having a separate section and having a separate chapter will always be helpful. And final thing is monitoring and evaluation. Right now, much of the monitoring and evaluation are done by the development sector agencies, but there has to be a system and a framework put forward by the local government to ensure that such monitoring and enforcement do take place, to make sure that all the prioritized actions are implemented in the spirit it's been designed and thought about. With that, I'll stop here, Divya, but I'm open to take a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahesh. It was wonderful. You brought out some very, very interesting points, especially to do with data mapping. I'm actually very glad that you spoke about not just data mapping, but also the guidelines and bylaws and working with the national, harmonized guidelines, because we as a program, we've also been parallelly working on some of these aspects and revising and understanding these guidelines more in detail with aspects particularly pertaining to persons with disability and their concerns and their needs. And we're working with IIT Kharagpur and Roorkee with respect to that. So some of those documents will also be released in a couple of weeks from now, and they're under review and they're under revisions extensively. So I think we are in alignment in that understanding that we need to act on multiple fronts. We need to understand their requirements and we need to map them spatially better and sort of understand their requirements, especially in a disaster as well. And you also rightly pointed out that pre-disaster drills are very critical, and it's not just for schools or offices. We need to also understand the needs of vulnerable population, how they need to be catered to and responded to while a disaster takes place, and how we need to how cities need to sort of respond to their needs in that point of time, and evacuation needs to be dealt with more, keeping their timelines in place. It's very we're glad that we are in alignment, highlighting similar aspects, but addressing them from the climate change risks and from that perspective. You have already managed to skillfully presentation, and I'm actually glad to sort of probe a little bit more and go deep dive into some particular questions and understand. I would want to understand, and I've been thinking about it while you've been speaking about it as well, that a lot of these aspects can be addressed much better through technology. uh, particularly to do with how we understand some of their concerns and how we can map them spatially better. So what type of innovations and do you think we cities should invest in, so to have affordable sustainable tech as a potential breakthrough, especially for low income neighborhoods, low income populations, where the concerns are sort of more heightened?
So I think whatever exists as a mechanism, technology with respect to municipal corporation and urban local bodies needs to be augmented. One, we do pay electricity bills and we do pay water bills and water taxes and things like that. Even though we mention it in terms of family, but along with it, the same kind of ID or the information can also be used for documenting whether that particular household also has people with certain kind of disability. That is a first starting point, because those numbers and those addresses are quite traceable, and in terms of need, the ID or the address can be provided to people in that particular area or in that neighborhood. And also any volunteer or police or anybody else who wants, or people who want to help them during times of need, they can access them and inform them. I think with respect to technology, there is no dearth of approaches, methods, models. Now you have Uber and you have things like Zomato and Swiggy delivering to your particular household using the address and the phone which you use. I think having something similar to that nature will always be yes. So I think there is multiple options which are currently available with our mobile phone. With the satellite remote sensing has advanced over time. Cities are now in the process of implementing ICCC integrated command and control centers.
Yeah.
There are video cameras situated all across. We do observe people suffering, and we do see we have access to people in times of need, but the only thing is vulnerability is still not mapped. People with disability is still not identified, and we don't know how many number of disabled people are there within a city. Because these are the numbers which are going to be helpful, and these should not be part of a census or a survey which is taken place once in a year. Anybody living in a particular neighborhood can automatically report to a system, and in terms of need or in terms of communication, they can actually get information depending upon where they are at that given point of time.
Yeah.
So it should be much more dynamic.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also to do with the command centers at city level now, which are actively responding to city level needs. So it also empowers the decision makers in that sense to understand what is happening in their cities and sort of respond in a much more well-informed way. So technology is a very empowering tool in that sense, both for the person who is facing the vulnerability and somebody who is supposed to respond to their needs in that sense. Another thing I wanted to discuss with you was, given your experience working with cities and given your experience working with ministries, what do you think are some of the challenges that government agencies or administrations particularly face towards decision making and ensuring safety and security for, particularly in this case, for vulnerable populations? And of course information is one, databases, you've already mentioned it through your presentation, so I thought it would be interesting to understand more from you on this.
So it's a two-way, top-down and bottom-up. I think what is required is a larger understanding and empathy amongst people. Like when I'm talking, I have my hand fractured and I'm kind of disabled in some form. I can't call myself disabled for a long period of time, but people don't have the empathy or even a consideration while you are in a crowded bus or you're in a crowded public transportation system. they tend to take it for granted and they don't give you that particular accommodation. And that's what I realized, over the last 2 3 days while interacting with people with a certain kind of handicap which you have. People don't appreciate it, or sometimes people do go overboard and make that person embarrassed in front of others, by highlighting a few things. But they are normal citizens, they want to be treated equally. At the same time, one has to understand the differential need. If somebody is disabled, probably they get prioritized. Somebody don't get into the push-pull mechanism while getting into public transportation or getting out of the public transportation. That should be a mechanism, or people in that vicinity always do come to and help and enable them, but that should not be treated as somebody exploiting the particular situation, but so on and so forth. So at a people level and at an educational level, people should be taught about different types of disability and how do you interact with people with disability, and how do you provide or cater or accommodate people with disability. I think that accommodation part is very important, and that should be taught early on within our education to people, and that should also be brought into consideration while doing efforts like safety drills and evacuation drills and things like that. Once we start doing it, then people will start considering it as a part of the planning and part of the project implementation and so on and so forth. At the top-down level, at an administrative level, they are always constrained with respect to budget and things which they would want to cater to more people with less resources. That has always been the game. How do you cater to more of them in a given constraint? Either less human resources, less technical resources, less financial resources. So what we should understand is at an early stage, if you intervene, the additionality which goes into for climate planning, for taking into consideration the vulnerable people, taking into consideration the disabled population, so on and so forth. The additional cost is not going to be much. It is going to be only to the range of 2 to 6%. But if you leave out the phase of planning and you start to intervene once the project has already been constructed or developed, I think then it becomes quite high. So I think what administrators need to think is, of course, cost is very important, but they should have an option, and there are certain standards which needs to be followed for certain aspects, like footpaths. You have amazing footpaths, and then you have pillars in the middle to prevent vehicles from going, but they also prevent wheelchair access. That is the kind of stupidity that can be avoided. You can still avoid these kinds of issues if you plan it well in advance, if your plan takes into consideration people with disability. And the cost is not going to be much. Actually the spacing of the boulevards may actually get the cost down if you cater to a wheelchair, then if you make sure that even bicycles don't pass through that won't be needed. So sometimes we end up over designing things, and sometimes we don't design things taking into consideration the need, the larger need.
We usually, you're right when you say that we tend to respond to how we can avoid certain things, and we kind of leave away the fact that the space eventually has to be used by everybody, and it is we also need to accommodate everyone. I think these are, and it's interesting that you're talking about training and capacity building, because we are parallelly developing training courses, and at this level we are focusing on developing courses which are more focusing on sensitization at various levels within the system, within city departments, for academia, and for young professionals, so that when they actually become part of the system, they are already more equipped and more aware and sensitized to the needs and they can better respond to some of these aspects while working on ground. One another interesting aspect that I wanted to touch upon with you was how recently Guardian article came, which talked about how Indian cities are some of the worst hit when it comes to climate change impacts, and so much so that for example, air aspects such as air pollution are taking away 6 years on an average life from 6 years from an average life of an Indian. So how do you think, because these impacts become much more severe when we talk about from the perspective of a vulnerable citizen who may be disabled, who may have much severe chronic impact of these from these climate change related aspects. So how do you think cities need to of course cities need to take a very fast action and critical action, but their action also needs to be more oriented towards tackling these impacts. So how do you think cities should respond?
I think cities should learn from one another. It is like what we are experiencing is not something new to us. What used to happen once in 10 years or once in 25 years, we are facing that once every 5 years or once every 2 years. So the intensity and the frequency of these major events are going to be highly variable in the coming years because of the climate change or because of the climate variability. In either case, people need to be prepared for the worst. And when we have a good record of history, good record of incidences which have happened in one place, how we can learn from it without experiencing it. I think that should be our idea. And like I said, in Indian cities, much of the service, we are suffering from service level deficiency in many sectors, many areas. So why can't we turn it around and use that as an opportunity? All new services, all new things will be climate informed, will be designed in such a manner, it will be inclusive. It will take into consideration the vulnerable people, the disabled people, also in how that particular infrastructure or service can act as provide duality of purpose to within their existence. So all these things need to be thought about, and also these infrastructures should we should ensure that they last longer given the extreme weather conditions and so on and so forth. So the investment is also safeguarded. So we don't end up investing too much on these infrastructure and we end up doing that every 5 years, which India can't afford if we need to cater to the large. So considering them, early planning, designing it better, building it back better, if at all an event of such nature such as Topate or currently Gulab does take place. And it's important to also look in terms of the future, not in terms of future projections, but just more in terms of the future risks while planning for our cities.
Thank you, Dr. Mahesh, for this very, very insightful presentation and your inputs on the subject and sharing not just your research and your findings, but also your commitment towards building better and a resilient urban ecosystem, particularly enthusiastically looking at it from the lens of an inclusive, urban perspective. On behalf of BASIC team and NIUA, I would like to thank you, Dr. Mahesh, for taking out time and sharing your insights through this session with all of us. And as always, it's always wonderful to hear from you, and it's always a pleasure to listen to your thoughts and realize that there is a pertinent need to act now, and not only on the impacts of climate change, but also looking at it from a more comprehensive lens. Before we close this session, I would just like to remind our audience that the lecture is part of an 8-part lecture series and can be easily accessed on National Urban Learning Platform and NIUA's YouTube page. And the link to both will be in the description box below. Thank you.
Thank you, Divya. Pleasure talking to you and the audience, and hope that the talk leads to some action on the ground in the near future.
Most definitely. Thank you.
Bye.